Back in May, when we in Nashville all still basked in the temperate air of a prolonged spring, a friend invited me to a movie one late afternoon. Given the beautiful weather, I was a bit reluctant, but I still checked the Belcourt's website to see if it would be worth sacrificing one of the last 75-degree days. The site read, "A few days before Christmas, having quit his job, Matthias returns to his multi-ethnic Transylvanian village." They had me at multi-ethnic Transylvanian village. Since I am a very recent addition to this community, and as such incredibly grateful for this opportunity to speak today, many of you may not know that I spent 3 formative years in my 20s in Transylvania teaching English to students at the Unitarian Seminary in Kolozsvár, as it's known in Hungarian, or Cluj, as it's known in Romanian. I was an employee of Meadville Lombard Theological School, working under the auspices of the UU Partner Church Council. My English lessons were there to better equip Hungarian-speaking future ministers to maintain relations between their churches, holdovers from some of the very first Unitarian churches, and their UU counterparts in the US and Canada. I moved to Transylvania just a year after graduating college and stayed through my mid-20s. When I sat down in the darkened Belcourt with my friend and the movie, Romanian director Cristian Mungiu's RMN began to play, I felt a sense of déjà vu. While some of the earliest scenes were set in a hellishly alienating German meatpacking plant, these were juxtaposed with a fictional Transylvanian village that triggered in me waves of warm memories from a happy time of personal growth and exploration. Mungiu is a talented director, but this ability to so faithfully recreate such a specific environment seemed like a particularly rare feat. As the camera turned from snugly nestled whitewashed houses with sharply peaked terracotta roofs to the little white stucco church and its awe-inspiring natural backdrop, I realized the reason I felt such nostalgia. Behind the church, in real life a Unitarian church, stood the mighty Seikekö, a forbidding bald mountain. That craggy rock face looming behind the ancient white stucco church of Torocko, or Rimetea, as it's called in Romanian, has long stood in my mind as a symbol of this bucolic region of Transylvania. It was the first Unitarian village I had visited, and I returned on several occasions throughout my time in Romania with students and Unitarian colleagues to get in touch with rural Hungarian Unitarian tradition. It was a world that felt deeply different from the 21st century American life I had left in my move to Transylvania. And yet, upon further immersion into Mungiu's film, I was reminded of other, less fond memories of my experience in Transylvania nearly 20 years ago, ones that highlighted a society where a much vaunted historical pluralism is perhaps less evident than retrenched ethnic and religious division and political polarization. In this sense, Transylvania reminded me acutely of debates and divides in the United States, a society also known for its pluralism, and of the ways that an image of pluralism can coexist with one of isolated communitarianism. Transylvania is an historically multi-ethnic region that has undergone millennia of conquests from groups like the Romans, the Huns, the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, the Nazis, and the Soviets. There have also been more peaceful migrations by Magyar, Jews, Armenians, and Roma. This history has left a multi-ethnic region where, when I lived there, an ethnic Romanian majority existed in tandem with a robust Hungarian minority that included the proud Székelyes, a Magyar-speaking group that apocryphally and incorrectly, according to historians, has origins in Attila's Huns, like Attila the Hun. Almost all Unitarians in Transylvania are Hungarian, and many are Székely. There were smaller historical minorities like Germans, Jews, and Armenians as well, but those 3 groups had become vestiges of what they once were due to varied tragedies of 20th century history. Unitarians occupy a proud historical position in this region and are connected to an important milestone in European religious pluralism. In 1568, Prince János Zsigmond, a follower of pioneering Unitarian preacher Francis David, decreed that churches and communities inhabited by the 3 nations, who were the Székelyes, the Hungarians, and German speakers, had the freedom to appoint clergy from whichever Christian sect they chose. This was a radical gesture of religious liberty in a Europe riven by post-Reformation creedal wars. While revolutionary, we must also recognize that this edict did not include the Jewish and Armenian diasporic communities settled in cities throughout the region, the enslaved Roma who had recently arrived in the region from the Indian subcontinent, or the Romanian-speaking peasantry who followed Orthodox Christianity. Nevertheless, this historical moment is one which Unitarians and UUs have recognized as symbolic of our faith's valuing of pluralism, not to mention one that highlights Transylvania's almost cliched image as a tapestry or mosaic of ethnicities, languages, and creeds. All of this history is to give context to Munju's film and to my own experience of Unitarianism in Transylvania. While I did not recognize it at the time, I sought this history in an attempt to reaffirm or even reevaluate my relationship with my church. A lifelong UU, like most of my peers in the church, I was raised by parents who left their respective faith communities in search of something more open to their lived experiences and something that encouraged even more searching. In my Massachusetts hometown, there were dozens of options for the searching, and it is a credit to our RE program just how many of those options we encountered. But when I would attend Catholic Mass with my grandparents or observe the Seder around the table with relatives and friends, even if those faith traditions had in some way been rejected by my parents or our co-parishioners, I at times envied the sense of rootedness that those faith communities brought to their adherents. My grandparents went to a church so connected to my grandmother's French-Canadian Catholic roots that it held masses in French until the 1970s, even though the wave of mass migration from Quebec to southern New England had ebbed by the year 1900. While I did not want to embrace the guilt and rejection that drove my mother from Catholicism, I wanted to see what it would be like to be a part of a church with that kind of cultural and familial bond. And though perhaps a less prominent driver than my youthful wanderlust, that certainly entered into my decision to travel to Transylvania in 2005 and teach English. The interior of the Torotsko Unitarian Church, deeply resonant to my own Transylvanian experience, also makes an appearance in RMN, albeit masquerading as a Catholic church, when it hosts some heated arguments at the heart of the film's plot. In the film, Chilla, an ambitious and cosmopolitan-minded Hungarian Transylvanian, hires several Sri Lankan migrants to work in the bakery that supplies bread to the village and beyond. The community rejects those migrants, citing a variety of reasons ranging from a lack of immunological response to tropical diseases, to a fundamental incompatibility with Western culture, to a generalized broad fear that new migrants would have a higher fertility rate and lead to their cultural extinction. The church becomes the venue for the villagers to voice these anxieties and prejudices, and where they made their decision to run the workers out of town. Munju based his film on real-life 2020 events in the Transylvanian village of Ditro, in which Hungarian villagers, led by their clergy, petitioned the village administration to forbid immigration and issue a formal apology to the villagers for having allowed foreign workers in response to a local bakery having hired workers from Sri Lanka. The events triggered debate in the Romanian media about the influence of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's anti-migration rhetoric on the ethnic Hungarian community in Transylvania, and further fueled tensions between those two groups, Hungarian and Romanian, in the region. I follow neither Hungarian nor Romanian media any longer, so these events only came to my attention after watching that film. That said, the debates and discussions in the film were extremely familiar to me. In much the way that I was thrilled by the nostalgia the stony face of Seikekö in the white steeple of the Torotsko church evoked, I was saddened to be reminded of the language of nationalism and exclusion that also permeated my life among the Unitarians of Transylvania. It was in that community that I learned the power of tradition and that I saw the way that folk arts can galvanize faith and ethnic identity. I saw eager young ministers and lay leaders organize dance and theater competitions that kept the youth active in the church and contributed to preserving the richness of Hungarian culture in Transylvania. I was invited to judge cooking contests where Transylvanian youth perfected traditional recipes for goulash and plum dumplings. I was amazed at the way savvy young Unitarians contributed to a liberal religious perspective to local Hungarian language media. It bears noting that despite some of the critiques I'm about to make, the Unitarian Church was at the time by far the most liberal in all of Romania, and at the time it was the only one that did not condemn homosexuality and only one of two that allowed women to be ordained. That said, my experience also taught me how ethno-nationalism can manifest itself and separate people from their wider community. I learned that Cluj and Kolozsvár are different cities, and that some bars and restaurants served Kolozsvár while others served Cluj. I heard students debate which villages were more purely Hungarian and which had been taken over by Roma people. I heard them applaud when one of their colleagues announced there were no more Roma in her village. I saw a Romanian nationalist mayor proudly plant 8 Romanian flags around a historic statue of a Hungarian king, and for good measure, paint all the benches in the square in the red, yellow, and blue of the Romanian tricolor. On the other hand, I had several older Unitarian ministers remind me that they had no problems with Romanians per se, but that Hungarians were more intellectually advanced, more European. While I'm sure I'm erring on the exact numbers, I will not forget the anecdotal evidence for this being that Hungarian Romantic poet Sándor Petőfi used 44,000 words in his works, while Romanian Romantic poet Mihai Eminescu only used 18,000. In other words, I came away from Transylvania having developed an appreciation for the rich culture of the Unitarians and Hungarians of other faiths, and an admiration for the work it takes to maintain such tradition as an ethnic minority. But I also came away distressed to be working in a community with values so different from the UU values of pluralism in which I had been raised. I still have Korondi pottery, it's from a village called Korond, around my apartment and read Hungarian authors in translation. I listen to folk rock bands, comprised in part by Unitarian ministers, that set Hungarian poetry to music, well, the one band. I also have a deep appreciation for Romanian culture that I developed, though, for the cinema of Cristian Mungiu and Lucian Pintilie, for the novels of Cărtărescu, for the voice of singers like Maria Tănase and Romica Pucianu, steeped in the Roma tradition. Even in the spiritual realm, I admire the rural humanism of the Unitarians, of seeing community and living tradition as stronger ways of orienting faith than a dogmatic acceptance of Jesus Christ's divinity. But at the same time, there were elements of the mysticism and devotion of Romanian Orthodoxy that resonated with my own spiritual approach. And I recall, when a beloved aunt in the US passed away, stopping by Cluj's Orthodox Cathedral and lighting a candle in her memory, an act that would have been dismissed as the superstitious practice of an inferior ethnic group by many of my students and colleagues. In other words, I embraced the ethnic, linguistic, and devotional pluralism of Transylvania in a way that members of the Unitarian community for whom I was working could not or did not. As an outsider, I quickly came to realize the answer to my question of how it would feel to be part of a liberal religious community steeped in local culture and tradition. Quite obviously, in hindsight, it would look a lot like my own church community back in Massachusetts, rather than this church in Transylvania. While UUs are often moving away from the faith of their upbringing, they're also bringing whatever light that still remains with them from those traditions to the table. While neither my mother nor myself can love the way that we choose and still live within the teaching of the Catholic Church, we both still value that church's focus on community. I see the mystical moments that my grandmother shared when she talked about answered prayers, miraculous medallions, and holy apparitions as acknowledgments of the interconnectedness of our seen and unseen worlds. We all bring our faith and cultural experiences to UU, and even if sometimes we are running away from those experiences, they remain a part of our pluralistic tradition. In one of our immense few love scenes, Cilla and Matthias, who is actually ethnically German, are flirting in Romanian, with Cilla chaffing Matthias for not knowing any Hungarian and trying to teach him. Matthias then goes off and speaks, to her surprise, in correct Hungarian. In a place where divisions and tensions are high, one's choice of language, of religion, of cultural practice become loaded spaces for affirming one's identity. At the same time, despite our chosen expressions of self, we cannot deny the ways our coexistence with other groups imprints on our lived experience. For me, part of pluralism should be the recognition that tension and disagreement are part of coexistence, and that if we can recognize the good we have absorbed from the other cultural and religious worldviews around us, we can perhaps better forgive, or at the least tolerate, the bad. I am not saying that we step back from injustice, but I am saying that recognizing these small bridges and bonds can prevent us from living in our personal, cultural, or spiritual solitudes. They stop tension and disagreement from becoming conflict and discord. Thank you.